When I saw the job ad, it sounded almost too good to be true. Night caretaker wanted at Willowbrook Cemetery. It was one of those quiet, out-of-the-way cemeteries on the very edge of town, and I figured it would be peaceful work. I was new here, a small town on the edge of nowhere, and I didn't have much keeping me busy or many people to call friends. Thus, following a rapid interview with a voice at the end of a telephone, I found myself clocking in for my first night shift. As I came in, the great gates groaned under my weight, their iron spires reaching up towards the night, like skeletal fingers. It had that old, overgrown feel to it, some kind of eerie atmosphere like something out of a poem under this ghostly moonlight. Everywhere, in all directions, rows of tombstones stretched across the flattened grass, some so old that names had washed away. I found a note folded neatly and pinned to the desk in the caretaker's shed. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, the writing of somebody in a hurry. Instructions for the night shift. Do not walk near the old chapel after midnight. If you see any movement, do not follow it. Return any objects you find on tombstones to the shed. Do not acknowledge the woman in black. I chuckled, tossing the note onto the desk. It was out of one of those old ghost stories. Rules of this nature no doubt scare the crap out of kids, but I wasn't superstitious. To me, at any rate, they sounded like pranks meant to mess with the new guy. Except for the periodic rustling of leaves, the cemetery was dead quiet. I started my patrol, hands sunk deep into my pockets, wandering amongst gravestones. I didn't turn on my flashlight, allowing my eyes to get used to the shadows cast by the moon. After a time, not very long, really, I noticed something strange about the atmosphere of the place. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Around midnight, as I approached the old chapel, something may have flickered in my peripheral vision. I whipped my head around in that direction and found nothing there, just row upon row of quiet graves and the outline of the chapel rising high above me. I told myself that, and maybe it was just the play of light. But as I went further, I might have sworn I heard whispers soft and low, such as voices carry on the wind. At the shed, I saw another note lying upon the chair. I had not seen this before. My pulse racing, I picked it up. Remember, some secrets are best left buried. I looked around half expecting someone to be watching me. The words stayed within my head, crawling under my skin. It was going to be a long night. The eerie charm had worn off by the second night in Willowbrook Cemetery. Instead, a creeping feeling of unease in me seemed to seep into the air. There was quiet now, but the quality was different somehow, heavier, as if something in the dark was watching me. Going into the caretaker's shed again, I found another note on his desk, scrawled in his now familiar hasty handwriting. This one was shorter, but somehow, the instructions seemed even more threatening. Instructions for tonight. Whatever voices you hear, don't show your reaction to. Whatever figures come into view, especially around the old chapel, never make eye contact with them. Objects left on graves may be returned to this shed. I read the note over twice, every word sinking in with an unsettling finality. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as a prank, but something at the back of my neck pricked warnings that this was something more. I pocketed the note, telling myself to forget about it, but the rules remained at the back of my mind as I resumed my rounds. The cemetery stretched out before me, cold and endless, its gravestones tinted in the pale light of the half-moon. Shadows danced between the tombstones, twisting in ways that seemed almost alive. I kept my flashlight off, allowing my eyes to adjust to the dim light, though it did little for my nerves. At Section C, one of the oldest parts of the cemetery, a whispery movement caught my attention. I whirled around, but nothing was there, just row upon row of silent graves marked with weathered, cracked headstones. I took another deep breath and forced myself to keep going, reminding myself it was my imagination again. But then I heard it. A faint voice, barely more than a breath on the wind, called my name. Jake. My heart pounded as I froze, the voice chilling me to the bone. It sounded far away distance yet unmistakably my name. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to remember the note's first rule: do not respond if you hear voices. I turned away from the voice, not calling back, and continued on. It followed me, softer and softer, until it was silenced. Every step fell heavier, the silence around me like a thickening fog. I was forcing myself to breathe, to listen to the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, to ground myself in reality. I couldn't let this place get into my head. By the time I had reached the far end of the graveyard, something in the dim light of my torch caught my eye, resting on one of the gravestones, a small, worn locket with its chain casually flung over the edge of the stone. It looked old, the metal was dull and dark, as if it had been there for years. Then a third directive from the note echoed in my mind: return any items you may find on the graves to the shed. I hesitated, feeling a strange resistance to touching it, but then told myself it was an object, nothing else. I picked it up very carefully and shivered at the chill of the metal. There was something engraved on the backside, a name, barely readable through the grime: Evelyn. Curiosity finally got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside was a faded photo of a young girl with dark eyes, a solemn expression, which hauntingly made me feel as if I had seen her somewhere before. The thought that I had seen her face somewhere wouldn't go away, but I quickly brushed it off and slid the locket into my pocket. I couldn't get the creepy sensation out of my head that something was indeed following me back to the shed. The shadows seemed to shift with every movement, and every rustling of leaves sounded like footsteps. Until finally, I arrived at the shed and placed the locket on the desk, attempting to disregard the sense of eerie relief that washed over me. I sat down to catch my breath, glancing around the small, dimly lit room. And it was then that I saw a piece of paper lodged under the corner of the desk, almost invisible. My pulse quickened as I pulled it free. It was another note, older and more faded than the others, with only one line scrawled across it. She is waiting near the chapel. Do not let her see you. A chill crept over me as I read the words. I turned to the window then. In the distance, the dark silhouette of the chapel loomed, bathed in shadows. Yet I knew I should simply ignore it, stay in the shed and wait out the rest of my shift. But something impelled me then, some unseen force that guided me toward the chapel. I tried to push it from my mind, to tell myself it was just curiosity, but as I began my rounds again, my feet seemed to take me in that direction of their own accord. The air grew cold, a biting chill sinking deep into my bones with every step I took in that direction. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I kept moving, drawn by some incomprehensible force. When at last I finally reached the chapel, I stopped, wrapped in the shadows of its crumbling walls. The wind had picked up and rustled the leaves in the trees, but around the chapel the air was unnaturally still. I scanned the area, my breathing shallow gasps, as that was when I saw her. A woman in a long billowy black dress stood by the entrance of the chapel, her back to me. Long dark hair cascaded down her shoulders melting with her dress, and for one weird moment I had an irrepressible urge to call out to her to break the silence. But then I remembered the warning: do not let her see you. I stepped back, my steps cautious, quiet. I kept my eyes off hers, softly shining in the shade of the chapel. My motion seemed to really set that cold, creeping dread on me, like I was walking away from something far, far older, and far darker, than anything I knew. I got back into the shed, closed the door behind me, and sat down to still my racing heart. The image of the woman seemed seared onto my brain as if it were a ghostly projection, the one which would not be banished. Whatever was going on within this cemetery was way beyond my comprehension. The rest of the shift was a blur of silence and shadows, till at dawn I was virtually running from the cemetery, not stopping until I was well out of the cold grasp of the night. But even as I drove away, one question burrowed its way into my mind, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. Who was this woman? And what was she waiting for? 2 nights in Willowbrook Cemetery, and one thing was certain: this place kept secrets. I couldn't dismiss the things I'd seen and heard, including my name whispered in wind, a shadow of a woman by the chapel, and strange leavings on gravestones. I thought about quitting, but something inescapable pulled me back. I need to know what was real in the darkness of the inexplicable. Arriving for my third shift, I steeled myself for whatever other strange directives I might find. Sure enough, there was another note waiting on the desk in the caretaker's shed, also scrawled in the same hurried handwriting. Directions for tonight. If you see shadows near the chapel, turn away and leave immediately. Avoid section D after 1 a.m. Do not stay in the same place for too long. Keep moving. I folded the note and shoved it into my pocket, and instantly a cold unease settled over me. It was as if the instructions were a warning, but of what I had no idea. Whatever was going on here, it was like I was scratching only the topmost layer, with each shift pulling me deeper. I began my rounds, cautiously making my way between gravestones. The moon was low in the sky, a ghostly pale hue cast over the graveyard. Shadows danced around me, twisting and turning at each step almost as if alive. While walking to section D, the air gradually became colder. I kept my flashlight fixed straight ahead, not wanting to throw any beam of light on the dark gaps between gravestones. The silence was almost palpable, weighing down with its heavy mass and loudening every rustling sound of leaves and each crunching footstep on gravel. As I walked along a row of tombstones, something glinted in the moonlight, a small piece of metal lying on the ground. Against my better judgment, I squatted down to take a look at it. It was a pocket watch, old and tarnished, with initials engraved on the back, J.H. I hesitated, remembering how the note said to keep moving in my mind, but it dug deep into my head that this watch had been left here on purpose. I pocketed the watch, promising myself I would return it to the shed by the end of my shift. I kept on, the cold air nipping at me. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper, and with it that nagging feeling that something was indeed following me, watching my every step. Then, close to the chapel, I saw them. 3 shadows, still as statues just outside the threshold of the door. They were tall and thin, their outlines barely perceptible in the moonlight, but I knew they weren't statues or grave markers. They were people. At least, they looked like people. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows didn't move, didn't flinch, and yet their presence just seemed to heighten a chill running down my spine. I instinctively wanted to turn and run, but the note's instructions echoed within my head: if you see shadows near the chapel, turn away and leave immediately. Slowly, I began to back away, my eyes never leaving theirs. I was breathing in short gasps, and the feeling of every step was an eternity pressed upon me, as if some invisible force was trying to drag me back. I continued to move onward and made a conscious effort to remain calm until the shadows disappeared from my view. I stumbled back to the caretaker's shed and slammed the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. Whatever those shadows had been, they weren't natural. Something was wrong with this place, something beyond my comprehension. And I began to wonder if staying had been a mistake. I looked down at the pocket watch still clutched in my hand. The cool metal was warm against my skin, and an overwhelming urge swept over me to open it. I slowly pried the cover open, exposing a cracked glass face and unmoving hands stuck at 113. My stomach twisted as a wave of unease went through me. This watch seemed to be a warning, but a warning about what, I didn't know. As the shed clock ticked past 1 a.m., a chill ran all too familiarly over me. The air grew heavy, the shadows outside the window deepening. I thought of the note's second rule: avoid section D after 1 a.m. But something made me look. I pressed my face to the cold glass, peering out into the darkness, and that's when I saw her again, the woman in black, standing among the graves in section D. This time, she was closer. Moonlight clarified her features, white, deadpan, and eyes that sliced through the dark. She did not stare at me, but she was looking dead square at the shed, it seemed to say, as if I would know she knew where I was. My breath caught in my throat as I met her eyes, locked there, imprisoned in the unnerving stillness of her gaze. The wind rose, rustling the trees, and a whisper cut through the air, so soft it almost wasn't audible. "Jake." My name, but in a voice familiar, yet far away, a memory echo that I couldn't catch. The woman raised a hand, her finger pointing to me, her face empty, her eyes vacant, yet full with something I couldn't grasp. I stepped back from the window, my heart thumping, the weight of her gaze pressing on me across the glass. The rules, the shadows, the voices, too much, and for the first time, I felt truly scared. No longer was I sure that I would make it through the night. The rest of my shift was spent in the shed in a blur of fear and silence, hardly daring to breathe while staring at the clock until the first light of dawn. When it finally broke, I came out into the cold morning air, bitterness as a harsh reminder of real things about that which I endured during the night. But as I walked away, one thought stuck in my head, and down my spine ran a cold chill. The woman wasn't watching me, she was waiting. I had told myself I wasn't going to return, that it wasn't worth the terror that only seemed to cinch itself tighter with each passing night. Still, as the sun set on my fourth shift, I found myself standing once again at the entrance to Willowbrook Cemetery, iron gates looming like some dark promise. Something kept pulling me back, an urge to understand, to know what was lurking in the shadows. Tonight, the shed held no note. Only an empty desk, with cold silence pushing down on me. I almost felt let down, but a part of me knew perhaps, just perhaps, there were simply no more rules that could help keep me safe. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the cemetery. The fog that had settled on the ground was thick, my flashlight barely cutting through it. Cold air bit at my skin, and I began to make my way through rows of gravestones, each silent and still, it seemed, watching and waiting. As I approached Section D, that eerie coldness washed over me. It was decidedly colder here, as if the life had been sucked from the air, leaving behind a feeling of dead, empty space. I quickened my pace, mindful not to linger, but something caught my attention. A grave marker unlike the others. Much smaller, it was weathered and cracked with a name barely legible, etched across the front in faint lettering, Evelyn Adams. My stomach twisted as I read the name. Adams, that was my last name. A flush of cold dread ran through me, that deep in the pit of my stomach feeling this wasn't coincidental. I tried to shrug it off to tell myself, no big deal, it was a common surname, but the similarity nagged at me, an anchor drawing me deeper into the mystery. And then I heard it. A whispered voice, soft and cold, cut through the chill in the air, no louder than a sigh. "Jake." I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, my pulse quickening. No one was there, only graves, silent and stretching out in every direction. But then the whisper didn't stop, it grew louder, clearer, like it was coming from every direction at once. "Jake." I scrambled backward, terror clawing at my brain as I tried to shut out the voice, to bury it beneath some other noise than that cold, dead sound. But the whisper continued to come, insistently, and it filled the air about me, leaned against me from every direction. Then, from the corner of my eye, I got movement. The woman in black stood in the distance, hazy because of the fog. She was closer now, her face buried in shadow, but I could feel her gaze pierce through me, as though she could perceive every secret, every fear that I had ever tried to bury. It went against every instinct, but I moved a step closer to her, my feet seemingly acting of their own accord, as if some unseen force pulled me toward her. The fog thickened, curling around my legs like ghostly fingers, tugging at me, begging me to take another step. My brain screamed at me to turn and run, but my body seemed in a different world, dragging me deeper into the dark. As I drew closer, the woman in black raised a hand, pointing toward the old chapel. Her face remained shrouded, but her eyes, they glowed in the dark, empty and haunting with a sadness that I couldn't begin to grasp. It was an overwhelming urge to follow her, an almost whispered command in the back of my mind, some calling to find out what truth lay concealed within those cold chapel walls. Every step taken seemed to make the world grow colder, the fog was thickening until I felt like I walked through some kind of dream, a nightmare I couldn't wake from. As I approached the doors of the chapel, I showed my reluctance. The solemnity of the moment weighed upon me. I knew I should not be here, that I was committing some irredeemable transgression. But the woman in black was watching now, her eyes were beseeching me forward, and I could not turn away from them, not now. I opened the heavy doors and stepped inside with a groan of wood. The air was stale with dust and decay, as if the chapel had been forgotten for centuries. The moonlight poured in through broken stained glass windows, eerie colors dancing across the floor. The single coffin sat on a stone slab in the middle of the floor, succumbed to years of dust. My heart raced as I approached, my footsteps echoing through the room, each breath heavier than the last. The name across the top of this coffin was almost too worn to read, but with the dust brushed away, I could read it now. Evelyn Adams. A wave of dread washed over me, harder than any I had known. I recoiled, my mind racing to put together the fragments of this impossible puzzle. Why was my family's name here? What connection did I have with this place, to the woman who haunted the shadows? Light, steady footsteps echoed across the chapel behind me. I turned to them, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and she was there. The woman in black stood in the doorway, her eyes fixed upon me with an intensity that sucked the breath from my lungs. With her next step closer, her eyes never off mine, a feeling washed over me for the very first time that I had known her all my life. Her face was pale and sorrowful, etched with a quiet sadness that spoke to something deep inside of me that I couldn't explain. In the softest voice, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "You were meant to come back, Jake." Her words chilled me, old fear congealing in my bones. The pieces started falling into place, and with each turn of the wheel, each piece dragged me deeper into a truth I wasn't ready to face. This cemetery. It was the place for the dead, but not only the dead. It was meant for the forgotten, a resting ground for those whose stories had been erased and then buried in times and memories. And somehow, I connected to it, was bound to this place in some manner I couldn't understand yet. The woman in black reached out and laid her fingers on my cheek, cold as ice. Memories came flooding into my mind, not my own people, places I had never seen, and yet each one seared my brain like a gash of pain and grief. And in an instant, just as suddenly as it had started, the vision ceased, and I gasped for breath, my mind reeling with the weight of what I'd witnessed. The woman's gaze softened, and she stepped back, fading into the shadows like a ghost. As she vanished, one thought remained, reverberating through my mind, reality which I could no longer deny. I hadn't come here by accident. I was always meant to return. By the fifth night, all illusions I'd maintained about Willowbrook Cemetery were gone. I wasn't here to collect a paycheck or because I liked simple night shifts. I was part of something much darker, something that ran so much deeper than I'd ever have thought. Each night, I'd been tugged closer toward the truth, one piece at a time, and now it felt as though the final puzzle was about to be revealed. The chill of the wind hit me as I stepped through the cemetery gates, carrying on its breath the scent of damp earth and something else, something older, tinged with decay. The air was different tonight, thicker somehow, as though the cemetery itself was a living, waiting thing. There was no note in the caretaker's shed this time, no set of instructions to follow. It seemed I was meant to know what to do. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I began my patrol, a slow pace through the rows of tombstones, each a silent witness to history buried beneath my feet. As I approached the chapel, a chill ran down my spine once more. The shadows that guarded the building were deeper and darker now, and I could feel something. A presence, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. My heart pounded as I approached, every step echoing back through the stillness. The chapel door was open, and I fancied I could detect in that vicinity the presence of the woman in black, close beside the coffin that had lain there the night before. Her figure was indistinct, shrouded, as it were, in shadow, yet her eyes, I felt, were looking upon me, steadfast and fixed, as if she had waited there to watch me pass through. I stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath my weight, the sensation eerily like the quiet click of a latch shutting, finality. It was now the moment I'd been pulled toward since the start, the truth I was seeking, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find it. The woman in black gestured to the coffin, her movements slow and deliberate. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to approach, my hands trembling. I reached for the lid. The air around me was freezing, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave and never return. But I couldn't. I had to know. With a deep breath, I lifted the lid. Inside was a small bundle, all wrapped in faded, tattered cloth, something altogether too fragile to have survived all these years. My hands were shaking as I pulled the cloth back to reveal a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. The name on the cover was faint but unmistakable. Evelyn Adams. My own last name. I opened the journal, my fingers brushing over the brittle pages, and began to read. They were all disjointed, fragmented entries, but they painted a tale that sent a shiver down my spine. There was once a girl named Evelyn living in this town, a reputation destroyed by rumors and whispers. She'd found solace in this very cemetery, comforted within the graves where nobody else dared go. And then she vanished. They had covered it up, erased her memory, buried her name in that chapel alongside her body. The journal told me she was my ancestor, part of the family that nobody remembered, erased from history. But she hadn't actually gone anywhere. Tethered by deceit and pain, her spirit had remained right here in the graveyard, waiting for someone to find her, bring her story back into the light. I looked up, my eyes locking with the woman in black, and for the first time, I understood. Evelyn's spirit had taken this form, a shadow that waited in darkness, a ghost that lingered in the place where she was abandoned. She wasn't haunting me. She was leading me, guiding me back through the truth of my own history. But there was more. The final entry in the journal was different, in a hurried scrawl that chilled me to the core. They're coming for me. I can hear them in the night, whispering my name, telling me I'll never leave. But if you're reading this, if you found me, maybe it means I'm free. The chapel creaked loudly and shook me back into the world. I glanced around, and for the first time on both sides of the room, I saw figures, shadows, so to say, very barely visible, but unmistakably human outlines. There they stood surrounding the chapel with their hollow eyes, their presence upon my chest like an unseen weight. In that moment, I knew they weren't just ghosts of the past. Souls, trapped here, anchored to this place much as Evelyn had been, and now they had turned their attention to me. She stepped forward, her face serene, yet in her eyes was an imperative with which I had no option to comply. She laid a cold hand upon my shoulder, conducting me toward the chapel door, and in that touch was her entreaty, a wordless, despairing prayer that I might somehow succeed where she could not, that I might take myself from this place, where she never could. I ran, my heart pounding, tripping out the chapel doors into the cemetery beyond. The shadows followed, their whispers louder now, more insistent, a chorus of voice upon voice that seemed to seep into my very bones. As I came to the gates, the whispering rose to a scream, a final, anguished scream that tore through the graveyard and beat with the awful sound of a pleading and a warning. And then, as I went out, the silence. The air was thick, stagnant, the cemetery behind me was drowned in darkness. The weight lifted, the whispers dying into nothingness as I took one last look at the place where my family's past had been buried. Yet, deep inside, I knew I could never really leave it behind. As I walked, I felt a dull, familiar chill brush my skin, a reminder that the shadows of Willowbrook Cemetery would always be waiting and watching, and that the past was never as far behind as we like to think.